Good afternoon, everyone. Today is Thursday, July 20th, 2023. I'm Dr. Umonja Smalls, Director of Professional Development for Maryland's Department of Health's Developmental Disabilities Administration. We welcome you to today's Rate Review Advisory Group meeting. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few things about the webinar. All participants are in listen-only mode. There are two options for listening to the webinar: by computer and phone. If you look at the panel interface to your right labeled audio, you can click either computer or phone to switch for the best option for you. We will be recording the webinar and posting this session on YouTube and the DDA website. Today's PowerPoint has also been uploaded as an attachment and is available to you to download in the webinar panel box along with today's agenda. Questions can be typed into the question or chat box in the webinar panel, and the team will review and respond as appropriate. And now I'd like to introduce Deputy Secretary Bernie Simons to begin today's meeting. Good afternoon, Bernie.
Good afternoon. And as Dr. Smalls just said, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Bernie Simons, and I currently serve as the Deputy Secretary in the Maryland Department of Health for the Developmental Disabilities Administration. It's a real pleasure to be here again today, and I want to thank all the members of the RAG for volunteering their time to participate to ensure that we've got a real good, open, and transparent process as we continue to move forward with this rate process. I'd like to turn this over now to our Secretary of the Department of Health, Dr. Laura Herrera Scott, to make some remarks and observations.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the July meeting. I want to echo everything that Bernie just said, to thank you for your ongoing commitment and dedication to this work. We know it's just another thing in the list of things that you all have on your plate, but clearly without you, we couldn't move this process along. So, want to reiterate his thanks. Appreciate the time you take to be part of the process. And then we haven't gone to the next slide, but did want to tee up that we heard you loud and clear last month, and so we will be clarifying and hopefully clarifying some of what we described that caused some confusion around the CPI versus the COLA. And then it was certainly brought to my attention when I stressed that we would not be looking at CDS, that then we'd have different rate years for a group of services, and that would just complicate things. So you'll hear a little bit more about the work that Optimus has started related to CDS. So all that to say is we do hear you, and even if the meetings don't always go according to plan, we still welcome the feedback after the meeting and then certainly take it into consideration. So appreciate all the work you've done so far. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Bernie.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. And so, we'll put the agenda up, and as you see during today's meetings, we will be discussing rate-related policies, and the status of the action items from the June meeting is, as Dr. Scott just talked about. And then we're going to talk about the general ledger data collection process, and Optimus will then walk us through their analysis of the data collected from the day hab providers with the FY25 data collection tool. And now with that, I'm going to turn this over to Jennifer to move forward with the next agenda items for the approval of the minutes. Jen?
Good afternoon, everyone. If we can go to the next slide, please. The next slide after that, I think. Actually, never mind, back one slide. Thank you. So members were sent an email with the meeting minutes on June 18th. And as co-chair, I will make a motion to approve the minutes. Would a member like to second?
Jen, it's Laura. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble with my controls for some reason. I I don't know when it's appropriate to do this, if you wait until after the second, but I did have a few comments about the minutes. Do you want to do that now?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead and share your comments.
Okay. I just realized, I guess after the last meeting and having gone back through minutes, it's, helpful historically to make sure, that they really reflect, some of the more granular details. So just a couple of things. On page 5, in the middle of the page, it attributes to me that I clarified my previous recommendation that CPI and COLA both be applied, which makes it sound like that was a recommendation I'd made in the past, and it's not. So I would ask that that be changed. I think what would be more accurate is to say that I clarified that I had not recommended that CPI and COLA both be applied, because I know that was my comment last month.
Okay.
And then on page 8, there's a bullet. Probably the 8th bullet down that says the process will update regularly to reflect more recent BLS data. And I didn't know if that was worth clarifying, that whether that was really to apply in the moment to the Meaningful Day services, because I think otherwise we would look back and think that that applies to all of them. And maybe that was the intent. When I looked back, it wasn't completely clear to me.
Got it. So I think on that first one, we can definitely make that change. On the second one, we can go back and review and make sure we clarify that point.
Okay, and then the last one is on page 9. Something looks like it may have gone a little haywire on the bottom 2 bullets. I don't know if that was like a text to speech issue that happened, but it sort of looks like the bottom 2 bullets, they didn't really make complete sense to me, particularly. I think I figured out what the first one meant in terms of 2-to-1 and 1-to-1. It's written a little strangely, but it might be just typos. But the bottom bullet, I think there must be words missing.
Okay, we will take a look at that too.
Okay, great.
And see what clarification we can develop. Absolutely.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Are there any other comments on the minutes? All right. So with the I guess edits and things that we will go back and revisit and clarify per Laura's request, do I have a second to approve the minutes?
I'll second.
Okay, great. So all in favor of approving the minutes?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, and the minutes are approved, and we'll get back to everyone with an edited version. And with that, I will turn it over to Robert for some policy updates.
Jen, it's Chris.
1 second, Robert. Jennifer, the only thing, make sure when you make the changes that they're tracked or highlighted in some way so people don't have to
Absolutely.
go to the areas, and so it's clear that the changes.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Will do.
Jen, it's Chris. Before we go to the next agenda item, just want to make a respectful request that if we can attempt to get REG documentation to the panel a little bit earlier. Last meeting was Monday of the week, and this one was Tuesday of the week. just really want some time to crunch through the information, and that time frame is a little difficult.
Understood. Yeah, I think we've generally tried to give a week, but I know we don't always hit that mark, but we'll definitely work on that for future meetings.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure.
Great, thank you, Jennifer, and good afternoon, everyone. Happy Thursday. So we do have one policy update for the team, and that is to share that the BLS wages will be updated for all of the meaningful day services, except for where there were decreases, in which case the BLS wage will remain the same. The services that will be receiving the 2021 BLS update are CDS, DayHab, and employment services, and everything that falls within those services. We'll be sharing an updated slide reflecting this update when we meet again in August. And just to recap, applying the 2021 BLS to the meaningful day service line was a policy decision made in order to address some of the concerns related to the adequacy of the meaningful day rates. One thing I'd like to share is that during the off cycle, we will be creating a formal policy that outlines how we will address BLS updates and COLAs moving forward, which will go to help ensure integrity and consistency with the process. And there will be an opportunity to provide feedback and input from the public using the same process that we currently use in the DDA for soliciting input on other policies. So more to come on that. Next slide.
Question, Robert, on this?
Yes, Karen.
So with these updates, when are you anticipating, is this for FY25 budget these are going to be impacted in, or wait, where are we?
Yes.
Yeah, we're in FY24. So
great question. Yes, this will impact the rates that would go live for FY25.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Next slide.
I also have a question, Robert, on the attachments you sent us. You have a no in whether it was used in follow along and large group. So I wonder, and maybe you'll get to that later, but I just noticed it seemed to be related to this topic.
Scott, could you please repeat the question?
Yes, in the one attachments, an Excel attachment, there's a column that says, did you use an updated BLS wage, yes or no? And it's yes, as you mentioned, for all the meaningful day, except for follow along and large group, and that both is no.
Yeah, that's correct, because with follow along and large group, the BLS wage actually decreased. And so we made the decision that we would not decrease that rate and take a look at it in subsequent BLS data because we think there's still some noise related to the public health emergency.
Good, thank you.
You're welcome. So here's a list of the topics and some status updates from the June meeting. The day providers data collection tool submission rate. We're still working on collecting that information, and we plan to share that compliance rate when we meet again in August. The BLS documentation and providing clarity related to that slide from the last meeting. We did post that information to the RAG website, and it's also linked in the handout here. GL template training and technical assistance. Those documents and resources have been sent out previously, but they're also on the RAG website, and we provide the link in the handout as well. And in just a few minutes, Optimus will be walking us through their analysis of the data that they collected with the FY25 data collection tool. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our Hilltop colleagues just to share a reminder on the general ledger data collection tool. Kristen?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Just a quick update on the general ledger data collection. The template, as Robert mentioned, and the training materials are all posted online. And we are at the point where we've transitioned into the implementation and data collection phase. We request the ongoing partnership and support of the RAG to encourage your networks and colleagues to review the tool and be prepared to submit data for fiscal 24 and reach out for any technical assistance as needed. Asking you to remind your contacts that the submission of the general ledger template is required. General ledger templates containing the fiscal 24 cost data will be due in September of 2024. And additional information and communication on the data collection process will be shared with providers as the due date approaches. And so there are links in the materials shared today and that you can download with the information about how to access the information, all of the resources that have been posted, as well as our email address to reach out for assistance. Again, just reiterate that the team is available anytime to answer questions, to schedule one-on-one time to walk through any specific issues you want to address. So feel free to reach out. And we look forward to hearing from you and continuing to work towards being able to collect that data for fiscal 2024. Thank you.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, we're going to turn it over to Steve and the Optimus team.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Steve Schramm with Optimus. I'm going to be going through 4 areas around the data collection tool. I'm going to talk about facility, program support, training, and then the feedback that we received as part of the data collection tool. Before I get into those detailed discussions, I need to address 2 issues up front. The first is several individuals pointed out that the slides contained an error for a program support figure. It has since been corrected on slide 18. I will point that out when we get to that. That is my responsibility. I am responsible for doing final peer review, and so that's my error. We have set in place a new process to address that and to reduce the odds of that happening again. The second area that I need to address up front is the confusion that Dr. Herrera-Scott mentioned from the last meeting. We provided a document as part of the materials that tried to clarify the slide around the treatment of wages, the source of the wages, and how they were trended forward. And I just want to give a brief explanation of that process to make certain that we were all on the same page. The rates are set in Maryland using a direct care wage model. The primary source for the direct care wages are BLS data. Those BLS data get trended forward annually. We initially started using CPI to trend those forward. We pivoted to COLA once the rates were applicable for the LTSS. The idea behind using the BLS was that these are aspirational rates. The wages that are used in the BLS are materially higher than those reported. DDA is looking to add additional dollars into the rate. Similarly, the use of the COLA also adds additional dollars into the rate. The second piece that I want to clarify is the BLS wage update process. That is a policy decision So we use the BLS wages as a base. They are published each year. We have used the BLS wages as of 2018. The state made a policy decision, and you heard Robert add CDS to that, for changing the base time period for the BLS from 2018 to 2021 for CDS, DAHAB, and employment services. So those are the 2 points I wanted to quickly clarify. We can go to the next slide. You've seen this slide before. This lays out the rate priorities and the focus areas for this year's rate setting process. I'm going to walk through the areas in gray today and talk about what we've been able to collect through the fiscal year 25 data collection tool. Next slide, please. There's going to be a lot of information that we're sharing today. So we want to give you an overview of how we're going to go through the process. We're going to show you screenshots of where we received the information as part of the DCT. We're going to talk about the instructions with the different cost categories that we're reviewing, facility and program support. We're going to share the initial data, and then we're going to show the results and discuss our preliminary recommendations. One of the things that I want to point out, as Robert mentioned in the June action items, we don't yet have the provider participation data. And so the recommendations that you're going to see today that we're making to DDA are subject to change if the number or size of providers that participated in the DCT process impacts the credibility of the data. But we wanted to be upfront about how we were moving through the data. Next slide. So this is the screenshot that I talked about for tab 1 of the data collection tool. This is the information that Optimus provided as part of the data collection tool. This is a fairly summarized set of information. We were trying to be cognizant of the feedback that we received as part of prior advisory group meetings and use a more summarized form. The next slide, slide 13, this is information formatting that Max submitted. This is a much more detailed look at the information. And we need to acknowledge that as part of the data submission process, several providers included both tab 1 and tab 4 data. The submission of the tab 4 information was very, very helpful, and we need to thank the Max team for providing this template, because it allowed us to review the information in greater detail and actually use some of the information that we were provided that we would not have been able to use previously. The purpose of showing the two screenshots is just to give you an idea of the level of detail that was provided. Next, I want to go to the next slide, slide 14, which gets at the instructions. The instructions, it shows the cost categories that we would like the providers to utilize. This particular tab is for facility results. This is traditionally a much more straightforward category. It is easier to identify facility results. Next slide, please. So first, I'm going to start by orienting everyone to this slide. So the horizontal axis, it provides the providers in alphabetical order. For facility, there were 44 total providers. You will notice some providers have 2 bars, some providers have 1 bar. This recognizes that not all providers were able to complete all of the tabs involved. What we are showing on the vertical axis is the facility component as a percentage. And what you see is there is significant variation in the data points that were provided. For reference, we have also included the current assumptions for facility cost for the 2-to-1 and 1-to-1 ratio. That's the green lower bar, as well as the current facility cost assumption for small and large group. Because of the variability in the tab 1 data, the blue data points, and the lack of detail in it, we chose to rely on the orange data points, the tab 4 data, because the additional detail allowed us to look at it and become more comfortable with the information. That additional detail and the consistency that you see in the orange data, we calculated a facility ratio of approximately 28.5%. And if you can go to the next slide. So what you see on this slide are some background information. First, how we addressed any outliers. The tab 4 data only had a single outlier. Next, you see the current fiscal year 24 component. It is split by the staffing ratios and then small group versus large group. And then the trimmed mean for the tab 4 data. You'll note that we're using a single calculation. In the past, we had more detailed information about the providers that submitted the data. And so we were able to split the percentage out by the different staffing ratios and small and large group. We don't have that at this time. And so we've calculated a combined average. So let's walk through what the results of our findings are before I open it up for questions. When looking at the facility cost data, the observation is there's less variation in the facility cost data compared to the program support data. The tab 4 information supports a higher component percentile to be included within the rate development methodology. We're recommending to DDA that they increase the facility component to align with more recent data, with the caveat that that is subject to change once the provider participation data are provided to us. So with that, I'm going to pause and see if there are questions.
Steve, this is Maria. Thank you for that walkthrough. Question on your criteria for outliers. You know, we were fortunate enough to get a a lot of the same data. Providers shared that their templates with us as well, and we were calculating a higher percentage with the data that we were seeing. Now we don't have all of the same data, but a majority. And so we did notice there were a lot of zeros in that tab 4 data, and so we're curious as to how you were treating any zeros, because clearly that wouldn't be an appropriate assumption.
Correct. We removed all the zeros from our calculations.
Okay. And then I guess the follow-up question is, are you using the total DSP wages as the denominator when you're calculating the percentages, or is it just the billable wages?
Can you clarify what you mean by distinguishing between the two?
Yeah, so I mean, there's when you calculate your percentage, we're looking at the facility costs, and then I think in the Optimus template, it had split the wages between billable and non-billable. Asked the providers to do that, and so I was just curious as to how you were using the non-billable wages, or if the denominator is the total. It looked to me like you were using the total wages, but I just wanted to make sure you weren't allocate, or how you were considering those non-billable wages.
So consistent with the other rate model components, we're using all wages.
Okay. All right. I'll save my question around the non-billable costs later. In facility, it didn't matter as much, but it does have an implication for the methodology in general. But I do agree that I think we were seeing more consistency if the facility costs were higher. We were just calculating a higher percentage, so it could be that we just don't have all of the same data. I guess maybe one last question. When you do your calculation of the mean, is it a weighted average or is it a straight average across the reporting providers?
So since we don't have the underlying information yet on provider size or participation, we're not able to weight it at this time.
Okay, so straight average.
Steve, it's Chris. Quick question for you. Is there value in looking at the data that we received back on the Max tab? And thank you for recognizing that there was value there. I know a lot of work went into that. Is there value in trying to incorporate that into the DCT moving forward? If we realized through the process that we got different data or data in different format that was more usable, is there benefit in incorporating that into the ongoing DCT?
Chris, that's a good question. We do recognize the value of that additional detail. And if it was deemed helpful by the providers to have both tabs available, that is something we would support going forward. We always want more data every chance we get. The one caution that I need to bring up is that there were some inconsistencies between tab 1 and tab 4. And so as part of the learning process, we need to be cognizant of that. And so, as we're talking about this data collection tool, we see this as a tool to be used annually. This is separate from the general ledger that we do need to have a line drawn in the sand so that providers can move forward with that, knowing it is fixed. So I want to make certain that we're distinguishing between the two.
Sure, and understood. I mean, obviously the document, the GL data collection tool is already out there, but I'm hoping that we can consider that, moving forward as a living, breathing document. If we don't get what we want or aren't able to get what we need, just, to be conscious of the fact that, it can be modified if need be. Obviously, heavy lift every time we do it, but I don't want to dig our heels in the sand and say it's final forever, as long as I think we can acknowledge that it may need adjustment moving forward.
Absolutely. And Chris, what DDA has committed to is constantly reviewing both the annual data collection tool as well as the GL template to make certain that they are appropriate and updating them as necessary.
Thank you.
Are we comfortable moving to slide 17 and going on to program support? I see Scott nodding his head. All right, Scott, you carry the day. Let's go to slide 17, please. So now what we're showing is the cost category tab that would have the definition for program support. And as Maria said earlier, which confirmed one of my earlier comments, the program support information, the data are more variable, and it's because there is more judgment involved in capturing and allocating program support expenses. And we recognize that. That is not something new. It is something we've had to deal with in the past. So as a result of looking at the program support results and seeing so much variation, we actually had follow-up conversations with a handful of providers to ask them questions about how they completed the information for the program support. And it helped us better understand the data and the source of some of the observed variation. So let me go to the next slide, slide 18. You'll note this is the slide that we corrected from the earlier deck that was posted. We had a single line included. We did not have the correct differentiation. What you see here is the same orientation. The horizontal axis is the providers listed alphabetically that submitted. There were 46 in total. The vertical axis is the program support expressed as a percentage. You will see, again, providers that have one bar, either blue or orange, or two bars. You'll also notice that providers that have two bars, there are some discrepancies between their tab 1 and their tab 4. The variation is quite significant in these data, so much so that we have concerns about utilizing this for rate setting. If you compare that variation to the actual assumptions that exist in the rate model currently, so the green line is the current program support assumption. The pink or fuchsia line is the current program support assumption for small and large group. So we provided those bars as benchmarks just to give you an idea of where the rate model has those different assumptions. What you'll see in this, similar to what we saw in the facility data, are significant variations such that we were not comfortable relying upon the tab 1 program support and facility data. The tab 1 data are not only quite variable, but they're also inconsistent with the more detailed tab 4 data. So not to say they don't inform our decision making, but we are not relying on them as part of the calculations. So if we move to the next slide, slide 19, we used the same criteria for the outliers. Again, the tab 4 data using that criteria only had one outlier. The trimmed mean for the tab 4 data, that's the orange, was 34.3. You will see for the current fiscal year 24 component, the 2-to-1 and 1-to-1 staffing ratio is approximately 27%, and the small group and large group is approximately 35%. Our observation is there is significantly more variation in the program support data. And at this time, what we're recommending to DDA is to maintain the current program support percentage for the day hab service types. Again, that's potentially subject to change once we get the provider participation data and we can see the counts and the weights associated.
Steve, it's Chris. Any sense of why you're seeing bigger swings in the program support data? I mean, I've got some thoughts, but I didn't know if you had a perspective. You've been staring at that data for a while.
We have been looking at it a while. What we've internally talked about is my earlier comment that the program support involves a lot more judgment and allocation. And so I think what it points to is we need to have further conversations with the provider community about how we standardize the categories we're using and we allocate the dollars.
No, I would agree wholeheartedly with that statement. I think that if we grab the whole puzzle as opposed to several pieces of it, we may see the flip side of another category being out of whack. And then, you know, where are the expenses going and where do they belong? So I appreciate you recognizing that.
And Chris, I think we have seen the value of the collaborative process. The training seminars that Hilltop ran as part of the GL template actually resulted in some changes to the instructions and the language and the format. So I think the collaborative process has proven to be quite helpful.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So if there are no other questions, I'm going to move to.
Sorry, I do have a question, Steve. Kind of as a follow-up to my question on the facility. So for program support, I noticed in the Optimus tab that was defined as just the non-DSP individuals that provide program support, whereas in Max and the tab 4, we had asked the providers to do their best to try to allocate how much time a DSP might spend on program supports, and that was separate from, you know, the non-DSP costs associated with program supports. And so kind of back to my original question around the non-billable time for DSPs, is that getting added into the tab 4 calculation? Because as you kind of showed the format of the Max, that was just the non-DSP component to try to line up with the Optimus, and it didn't add in. You have to manually add in the allocation of the non-billable time associated with DSPs for program support. So again, I'm calculating a much higher percentage using tab 4 than what you're showing, and I think I'm concerned that there's a difference in interpretation of the data that was provided.
So I think what would be most productive, Maria, is if you could provide your calculation to us so that we could collaboratively look at how you've made an adjustment. We are comfortable. We've had conversations with DDA that we can share in aggregate our calculation information with you. And so if we could compare the two methodologies, I think we could resolve any differences.
Okay. No, I think that would be helpful. And I'm assuming the outliers, again, the criteria is similar where you removed zeros in your calculation and had just the one outlier that we noticed, one that just didn't report DSP wages correctly, and so that messed up all of their other percentages.
Correct.
Okay.
Hi, this is Scott. You mentioned, Maria, it's facility-based, using billable versus non-billable time. And Steve, it sounds like that's the way that you all have done it in another analysis, but it does strike me, even with facility, if I'm only getting that facility for hours that I'm billing, then it would seem to me the denominator or numerator, which is the correct term, would need to be the billable time. If, you know, and I would say the same thing here. And I don't know if there's anything to be done about it, but it seems like a fundamental issue. If I'm only going to capture my program's facility costs, when I have someone providing a direct service and yet I'm paying for, I've got wages when they're on vacation and everywhere else, and we're using all those wages, then there's no way I can recoup all those facility costs. So I don't know, just throwing it out there. I know you've thought about that before. If there's something, you know, down the road, you consider that.
So Scott, the way the BRIC methodology works using a direct care wage model is it is structured to focus on billable time, but the other components that are non-billable are intended to be captured by the other categories like ERE and admin. And so what we're trying to do, and this is what Maria is getting at with her questions, is we're trying to be consistent and make certain that if we're using billable hours as our metric for how providers get reimbursed, that we are capturing all of the total dollars up in the numerator, so that when we divide it by the billable time, ultimately the math works out so that we've captured total expenses for a provider.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
Okay. Any other questions before I hand it to Robert for slide 20?
Steve, it's Chris again. You just mentioned, I missed a piece of it. You said that it was designed to capture the ERE and the admin. Can you repeat that sentence for me, please?
Yes. So the direct care wage model has a number of components associated with it. We're right now focusing on just facility and program support, but there are other components that capture other items like ERE and general and administrative costs.
Okay. Is that go back to, because on slide 10, and I was going to bring this up at a later point, but maybe now is a good time. You actually have verbiage in there that the billable versus non-billable is implicit in the rates. Is that what you're talking about?
So the point that we're trying to make is that a direct care wage model starts with a wage base, and then everything else, all other expenses incurred by a provider, are accounted for in the other categories.
And I think that's the piece that we've been struggling with all the way back to last year, which is, we had the entire fixed versus variable conversation. There are items that, we looked at it, we saw it last year in the transportation data collection tool that we did, where we had a fixed and a variable component to the transportation data, and we were taking the fixed number and we're dividing by 8. And we all know as a provider that there's no way we're ever going to be able to build full 8, so we know we're never getting back to that fixed component. And I think that goes to several different calculations within each of the components. I mean, I got they're all a little bit different, but yeah, billable versus non-billable is still, there's got to be a factor somewhere. I don't see how collecting that piece in the full amount, I don't see how it's being included in the BRIC if I'm not able to bill back the full 8 hours. I guess that's the part that I'm missing, and I think I've been missing it for a year.
Sure. So each one of the components is intended to be as close to a data-driven component as possible. However, we know there are going to be variations and disconnects. As a result, we're using categories to add additional dollars in so that at the end, we end up with an aggregate dollar amount that is intended to match your total expenses. The largest implicit adjuster that we use is using the BLS wage, which is significantly higher than what you all are showing as your average wages that you're paying. So while not perfect, we are trying to adjust for each of these as a proxy.
Can I ask a question, Steve, or clarification? I thought I understand the BRIC methodology the way you're describing it, but I thought our question related to the data collection. If the data collection excludes non-billable time, then how is there data to support what you're saying, which is those costs, the full costs are built into components of the BRIC. And maybe I just, I appreciate the fact that you said you would, work with Maria around her calculations. But to me, the question isn't how the BRIC pays, it's does this data collection capture 100% of the costs that then get allocated into the different components of the BRIC?
The data collection is intended with all of the different categories to collect all of the costs that providers incur. We have not addressed all of the components this year. We've only addressed facility and program support.
Right, but I guess it's still the basic question about does the data collection include non-billable expenses that would ultimately be directly non-billable? And I hear you saying that it does.
We have instructed as part of the rate setting cycle that we've done in the past years, providers to include 100% of allowable costs per the CMS guidelines. We've talked about what allowable costs are. And so it sounds as if there need to be further conversations to clarify with the providers about the submission of costs and how they are captured in the different categories, and we are very comfortable doing
that. Okay, thank you.
So I guess, Steve, I'm confused though by your earlier comment around the BLS wage. Is the BLS wage supposed to be the wage period, or is it supposed to be a wage that reflects a productivity type of adjustment that includes the non-billable time? Because there's really two methods that states, as you know, and you all have done this in other states, where you have an explicit adjustment for the non-billable time that grosses up a base wage to get you to a wage that includes billable and non-billable time. And we don't have that methodology in Maryland. And so because there isn't an explicit factor, I understand, we're trying to push some of those non-billable hours to the numerator in some of these components, but you also have to then use an appropriate denominator when you're calculating those percentages in order to tie back to the total dollars in a cost report. And I'm happy to, have that part of our follow-up conversation, but that's the piece that I'm concerned about, that somehow methodologically we don't have what we need to tie back to the original cost reports. And I do think that tab 4 provides a bigger, a complete picture, and you can see very clearly how the math should work. based on the current BRIC methodology or an alternative methodology, which would be to make an adjustment for the non-billable time.
The current BRIC methodology does not include a productivity factor because we have in the past not received sufficiently consistent data to calculate a productivity factor. The tab 4 data that has been provided as part of this process is better and more reliable, but it is still not sufficient at this point to create a productivity factor.
Steve, can I ask a question? So in other places where you've done this work, so we went from prospective payment on a daily rate to where there wasn't really an issue around productivity. So our data collection, our way of thinking as providers, it may not even have it didn't need to delineate that out because of the methodology of payment and the methodology of how we track this. And so as you go for a fee for service, especially when you look at like 15-minute increments, which is, you know, vastly different than a 1 day kind of a, you know, prospective payment rate, you know, and you're just absent or present and that's it. Have you found in other states that the organizations may not have had that kind of data in the beginning, and then as time went along, as we started to experience, as somebody, now we've been in for a year, almost, you know, I guess 2 years now, right? We've been in LTSS, and so that's something I never really thought about before or had to as a provider think about because we had a day, you know, a day, whether I had people working 6 hours or 8 hours, it didn't really matter. But now I do have that. So I'm wondering, I as a provider have found that I have to shift how I think and how we determine that because of billable and non-billable, and we didn't have to do that in the past. Do you have a little bit of history with other states? And I guess even Maria, you've worked in other states as well to see, is that something that the skills get developed along the way, and as more providers get into LTSS and take this kind of a review, that it changes how we document?
Yes, Karen, you're describing exactly what our experience has been. The process takes time. Gradually over time, providers begin to capture more granular information when they move from billing on a daily basis to smaller increments. And as those data become available, we would review and not only potentially consider a productivity adjustment, but as Chris and Maria are pointing out, that has ripple impacts in other components of the rate methodology. So it exactly happens that way. It gradually over time improves.
Okay, thank you. And so you would consider in the future gathering that data, because we don't even have everybody in LTSS yet. And so they're not even thinking this way in a lot of situations. And I know, and Greg, you probably are in the same situation after having done this for 2 years, we're really thinking about it, and more so in things like employment than in CDS, right? So milestones, really thinking about that. So I definitely think we're gaining skill in that area, and we're gathering that information. And I really appreciate hearing from you that your intention is, as the providers change how they're collecting the data, that then you will change how you ask for that data. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. Appreciate the feedback.
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, in other states, you know, they might do a time study. So they might have the providers track, you know, their time, you know, for the DSPs for a couple of weeks, just to, you know, a representative sample to try to get to that billable, non-billable time. It is hard because, you know, you've got some things that, like if you do training, you know, depending on which weeks you hit, you know, that's a little harder. But but getting to program supports, getting to transportation, those kinds of things that are day to day. If you track it for a couple of weeks, usually that can satisfy CMS's understanding of the productivity factor. I mean, it's a pretty big adjustment, and so I feel like even the data that we did see from both, you know, the tab 1, the Optimist tab, and then the tab 4. I mean, that shows, you know, an adjustment between 20-30%, which is pretty standard for a day hab type of rate. You know, I mean, you know, and because you're moving from a daily or a daily rate to an hourly rate, that's why it becomes a lot more important when you're paying on those hourly rates. And so I do think, assuming nothing is not appropriate, and something real, and that could be contributing to the fact that the rates for the day hab are not adequate. And so it's a pretty big adjustment. I think it needs to be calculated properly, but I think it should be considered even for fiscal 25, because I think that's causing some of the challenges.
Do you believe that there's enough data from other states that have gone to fee-for-service that we would be able to norm it in some way and use it as a base until we have our own data source?
I mean, from my opinion, I thought we got some decent information. I mean, there's still a big range, but I felt like the allocations between billable and non-billable time for the DSPs was, I mean, honestly, I thought the productivity was pretty high, you know, in based on what I've seen in other states for the, I do think some assumption we could maybe collaborate on what might be appropriate, and then continue to collect better information. I do think the new GL tool, as I was looking at it, will capture this too, in a way that will be really helpful going forward. So I think it's just a matter of making sure we're all comfortable with whatever, you know, data we have, and trying to apply it in a way that's reasonable.
And we appreciate the feedback about the productivity factor. The wage assumption that we're making is significantly above the base wage that's reported. So we're comfortable that we have a reasonable proxy. This is not a simple adjustment to the rate model. We recognize how important it is, and it has significant and material ripple impacts on the other categories. And so this is not something we would undertake lightly, but as Karen Lee is saying, as the data are improving, this is absolutely something with sufficient runway. We would recommend DDA consider adjusting the methodology.
Thank you.
I guess my only other comment there is Steve, you had mentioned earlier on the BLS wage that was an aspirational wage, and so it wasn't necessarily intended to you know, adjust for productivity, and so that's where I feel like, you know, an explicit productivity adjustment. I don't disagree with you that the wages paid today are different from the BLS, but the BLS wages, I think, were aspirational to get to higher wages for DSPs, and if it's implicit, it you know, we lose that information, and it's not clear to me. I think an explicit adjustment would be more appropriate.
Your feedback is noted, and we're very comfortable that the wages that we are paying are sufficient for both aspirational and any productivity adjustment.
I'm a little bothered by the word aspirational. I think I looked at that one chart, and you have community living, or not you, I apologize for that. We have the chart at $21 an hour. I think you show our hands around here, we're all pushing close, you know. So it's, you know, we're taking those wages as real, and we know how valuable the DSPs are. So we're paying this, we're pushing those wages. So I just a little bit bothered by the word aspirational. when in reality, we love our DSPs, and I know a lot of these folks here are paying more than I am, and I'm pushing that.
The use of the term aspirational recognizes that the BLS wages are higher than those reported by the average data.
I just want to make one comment. When I think about having discussions with, legislators, Department of Budget and Management, or whomever may look at our rates, if the thought from the department is that the wage in the rate is also being considered to be adequate for productivity, that has to be stated somewhere, because otherwise people look at it as the wage, and that will create a number of issues and probably confusion for some folks. So I don't remember that ever hearing that statement before. Maybe I missed it, but I do think if that is the case, it certainly makes me uncomfortable, I will say that. And if it is in the short term, the consideration, and I agree with Maria, I think it's really important to address it, but if the decision is not to address it this year, I think it has to be really clear that that wage is not being thought of as only the hourly wage.
And Laura, I'll follow up your statement there. We need to know exactly what that productivity percentage that is implicit in the wage is. I mean, if we're thinking $21 an hour and providers on paper are paying $17.50, are we paying the same thing when you take into consideration that productivity adjustment? And Steve, I'll throw this out there to you as well too. I think we've struggled with the day rates, the day side, because the productivity is going to be so much different. We've not struggled with the residential rates in the same capacity. And that, to me, is an indication, because the productivity in residential, you're at 97, you're 98%. You're nowhere near that on the day side. So I think that you're seeing that if that number is implicit in the BLS, or you're including the BLS thinking, hey, it's much higher, every provider that's on the phone or on the seminar today, all would love to be paying that 21, and in all honesty needs to be paying that 21 to get qualified staff to do what we need to do. It's getting to that level that's going to make the biggest impact for the individuals that we serve and the stability of the providers that are in the community. They're doing the work.
Chris, we agree with your sentiment. It is very important. We have been very clear in saying that the data are not there to support productivity adjustment at this time. And Laura, I'm going to defer to Dr. Herrera-Scott, but we do not have any intention of reopening the fiscal year 25 rate setting methodology to include a productivity adjustment at this time. Any other questions on this slide before I hand it back to Robert?
So maintain the current program support percentages for now, and continue to do what then? What are your thoughts on what would the next step be for getting program support percentages, dealing with all the variability? You may have said it, Steve.
So Scott, what we would recommend, and I'm following up with the question that Chris asked, and that is, I think we need to have further conversation with the provider community about the definition of program support, about what data are available to support more granular allocations of the cost categories within program support. We will later on in the process, I have one more area on training that I need to provide an update, and then I'm going to walk through some of the feedback that we requested via the DCT. And you will note that there sometimes contradictory requests during the feedback, but what it points to is this idea that we need to get people level set on the different categories and how expenses are treated in the methodology.
When I did my tool in program support, I put in some of the unbillable time because, you know, I have 8-hour employee and they're only billing for 6. Those extra 2 hours are really support. They're doing things that they can't bill for. I'm not sure that I interpreted that correctly. My percentage came up to 71% as opposed to 34. So my thought would be, you know, as you have conversations with providers, where do we put time that we can't bill for? You know, is that a program support function in order, going back to your first comment to me, in order to make sure all those add up into the rate model? Just a comment, Steve.
Appreciate the feedback, Scott. Are we ready for Robert in slide 20?
So could I just put something forward? I guess we haven't ever really done this, but I would say that if this group, which is the advisory committee, we seem to be using Robert's rules with you know, putting forward a vote, that if there is somebody who wants to put forward a vote, that we ask DDA to reconsider using these variables in the FY25 rate, that we absolutely can put forward a vote for that. And as committee members, make that vote, make that recommendation. Not that they have to follow it, but rather than, you know, Steve's saying they're not doing it right now. And if we as a group feel that we'd like for them to address that, we certainly have the ability to put forward a motion that we make this recommendation to DDA to do that.
Karen, I'm not sure I'm comfortable doing that. But,
Okay.
Okay, any more questions related to the slide before we talk about next steps?
Robert, can I just say I appreciate what Karen said, and I understand that folks may not be comfortable, but I think it, you know, at a minimum, hopefully the minutes will reflect that the robust discussion and the notes about how important productivity is to be addressed. I would just say as soon as possible.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura. That's been noted.
And I would also include in other data collection for other services going forward.
Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. So the next step is for us to continue to study not only the analysis that Steve presented today, but also continue to have internal discussions regarding Optimus's recommendations, and then we'll be prepared to give this team an update in August. Okay, next slide. All right, and now I'm going to turn it back over to Steve, who will give us an overview of the training results.
So as I mentioned, there are 3 areas that I'm talking about today. We've already talked about the facility and the program supports. This is now the 3rd area I'm going to talk about. These are the training results from the fiscal year 25 DCT. I want to be clear that this step is different from the facility and the program supports. While for facility and program supports, we made a recommendation to DDA for them to consider, contingent upon our review of the provider participation data. We are not at this point making a recommendation to DDA on the training data. We're going to share it today and ask for feedback as part of the RAG process prior to the next meeting. So with that, I want to walk through the training results because there are a number of additional assumptions and steps that go into training. And so those policy decisions are more complex for this particular component. So next slide, please. We requested data using a tab in the fiscal year 25 DCT. We asked for count of employees, requiring initial training and ongoing training. At the end of the day, what we're trying to do is gather total training hours so that we can do a calculation and look at those training hours as a percentage of the total hours worked. Next slide, please. So on slide 23, I'm going to give you some of the results associated with the training information. We received 50 responses. However, 14 of those need to be excluded because they were showing 0 hours worked or 0 employees requiring training. We don't want to rely upon that information. The other adjustment to the base information was we had hours that did not comport with our attempt to look at annual hours. So we adjusted those totals. So the example that everyone uses is that you assume 40 hours for full-time implies approximately 2,000 hours per year. We did have to do some exclusions for what appeared to be unreasonable data. We excluded one response because the hours would have exceeded 2,600 hours. And we also excluded 9 responses because that appeared to be too low of a number of hours for staff, full-time staff needing ongoing training. We think by doing this, what we've done is we've balanced the data more reasonably from what was submitted on an unadjusted basis. Next slide. So we started out with 50, 14 were removed for zeros. We had then 36, 10 were trimmed above and below. That yields 26 responses. This is a significant number of employees. The hours worked are quite large, and that provides us with implied weekly hours of 36.5 for full-time and part-time of 15.8. This is a data point that we're presenting and asking for feedback as part of your role on the advisory group as to whether those appear to be reasonable. Any questions, comments, or feedback before I go to the next slide? Okay, can we go to slide 25? So one of the steps that we also wanted to lay out was how are these initial data comparing to what we have in our current model assumptions. So first, we are still in the process of finalizing, but it shows more required training hours, a higher share of staff is full-time. And so we are thinking that we need to get feedback from the provider community to make certain that these are reasonable results. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is we would like to replace the 39.6% turnover assumption that we have in the model with actual updated information showing your experience. But before we do that, we want to make certain that you all are comfortable with the information submitted, as well as we are comfortable with the information submitted. So as we go through this information, again, what we're hoping for is feedback before the next advisory group meeting. We are still in the process of validating the information. In between this meeting and the August meeting, we may reach out to providers and ask questions about this. The other component that we are going to make certain that we incorporate is we adjust the ongoing training to include the new requirements. So there are still several moving parts, and so you can see why we have not yet made a recommendation to DDA on the training data. We move to slide 26.
Steve, can I just ask a quick question?
Yep.
When you said you want to make sure that this group is comfortable with the what we have currently in terms of data, I just want to make sure, because everybody was quiet, I want to make sure I know. So are you asking specifically about the higher percentage of full-time staff? Kind of, does that seem, accurate, or are you asking about what's on slide 24?
We're asking for feedback on all of the data points that we have provided today. So that includes the relative percentage of full-time versus part-time. It includes the data on slide 24.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if folks can answer in the moment or not, but I just wanted to make sure I understood the question.
Well, this is Karen from Providence, and no, I cannot answer in the moment. But I thought I heard you say that you wanted that feedback before the next meeting. Was that right, Steve?
That would be ideal so that we can incorporate it.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
One of my concerns with training is there's quite a bit, and DDA has done an excellent job in updating their training list, and it's very helpful. There's a lot of training that we have to do in order to stay in business that's not required by the DDA. Just being a business, there's a lot of things that we have to do. And it seems like if what you're seeing is higher training than what you expected, that may represent some of that. Am I interpreting that correctly, that it seems like it's higher than what you anticipated the training hours needed?
I don't want to say we have any assumptions one way or another. We have heard that feedback in the past from providers.
Yeah, it's just, well, I mean, I'm sure you're all in the same boat. The amount of training that you have to provide as a business just grows every other day from OSHA and everybody else. So those are all training requirements for on top of what the DDA requires. And again, it's worthwhile training, but it takes a lot of time. Thank you.
Scott, would you consider that possibly to be something that could be handled under the previous discussion that we talked about, is the productivity hours?
Well, I mean, it could be, Karen. And I don't know.
Because it's so variable for every agency.
Yeah, I think that's where we need to define downtime, and that's where, the one-to-one service, we don't want to get into this, but you lose a lot of time in one-to-one while you're doing that you can't bill for. So I don't know, that downtime, they do have to define that, Karen. What is included in that?
Karen's point is a very valid one. This is just like every issue within this rate development methodology. It is potentially interrelated and will touch several components. So the training has an impact, whether or not is incorporated within productivity. Each one of these components, it is challenging to look at in a vacuum. We are trying to separate the components in a way that is reasonable and make recommendations to DDA about appropriate adjustments for each annual rate setting cycle. Okay, I'm going to just talk about next steps for the training. We would like to receive feedback from the advisory group on the data points that we have provided. We are still working with DDA on the final training hours that are required. And then as we compile that information, we need to compare it against the data that we have, what are the assumptions in the model, and our intent is to share the impact in the August meeting. I'm going to transition now to the fourth area. So I've talked about facility, I've talked about program support, and I've talked about training. Now we're going to go to the next slide, and we're going to talk about the qualitative feedback that we received as part of the fiscal year 25 DCT. The idea here is not that I'm going to walk through every comment. What we tried to do was identify some themes. Honestly, one of the reasons why we wanted to share this information was to help us think about future rate setting priorities, because if we identify feedback that is potentially inconsistent, that will potentially also identify areas where we need to make improvements in the understanding of the data collection and the rate methodology. So from a overall perspective, we asked for providers' feedback in two major areas. First, general feedback on the data collection process, and then second, feedback specifically on the group size and the rate structure. I'm going to break the discussion down into those two major areas and then have sub-themes underneath each one. Let's go to slide 28 and the data collection. So very consistent feedback that the operations at the provider agency level are definitely still being impacted by COVID. The intent of that feedback was primarily in this area driven to recognize that there may still be gaps in the underlying data points that we are using and asking for the providers to collect. Another major theme was an anticipated increased costs in facilities and the services associated with facilities. The third area has to do with LTSS and the transition. And this actually is similar to Karen Lee's earlier comment. DDA needs to recognize the feedback from the provider community, is that DDA needs to recognize that this will be a transition time period and needs to take into account that the data timing will be impacted by emerging trends that may not necessarily be fully captured during the transition time period. And then the last major comment theme was the challenges of data collection. You all have constantly reminded of us of that during the advisory group. We recognize how challenging it is to dedicate the time necessary for reasonable allocation, for dealing with the different time periods involved in the different potential rate structures. So the feedback here is just a good set of reminders for Optimus as part of our rate setting approach. Next slide, please. So the DAHAB and the group structure feedback, we actually asked 2 specific questions. What data points can we collect from providers to help us compare methodologies? In this area, it was very easy for us to gather all the information together and give you some numbers on it. So 19 providers responded. There are 4 general categories to this first question. Now, note that this is feedback from the provider community. This is not Optimus nor DDA. And so what you're going to see is there's potentially some inconsistencies in the feedback here. But what that does is it points out areas where we may need to have further educational and training seminars like Hilltop was able to complete for the development of the GL template. So the first area, the primary feedback on group size and ratios was, could we align the day and CDS group size and rates? Now I understand some of that is inconsistent with other feedback. We just want to provide that just to recognize that there is not consensus about how the rate structure ought to be developed. And so that points to, we need to have further conversation to understand what are the underlying issues around day and CDS group sizes and rates that would cause one provider to say we need to align all of the group sizes and rates, and have another provider say we need more differentiation. From the operational challenges associated with the DAHAB and the current group structure, the providers, we had several say they have challenges tracking the costs and billing by the size differentiation that we have and by the staffing ratios. Another important data point, and this echoes Chris Park's comment about fixed versus variable cost. Providers have continued to give us feedback that there are significant financial impacts by picking different group sizes. And so before any group size is chosen and finalized, there needs to be significant conversations with the provider community. And then the final, for question 1, piece of feedback has to do with the challenges of pulling together transportation related data. The next slide, slide 30, gets at question 2. We only had 11 providers respond. How could we use this data to inform any decisions? They fell in 3 major areas. Now what you're going to see are some inconsistencies, and we're not saying this feedback is wrong. What the inconsistencies, again, point out is where we need to have further conversations to understand why one provider is asking for X, which is in direct conflict to another provider asking for Y. So on rate assumptions, there are a number of providers requesting additional variation in the cost components. As to structure and rates, there was no consensus around adjusting group size. There were a number of providers who said the current group size are fine. There are a number of providers who said we think we should review the group size for the future. And there were a number of providers who said they'd like to see the group size adjusted immediately. An interesting and very important piece of feedback that we have provided to DDA around the group ratios. So this is the 1-to-1 staffing and the 2-to-1 staffing. There were several comments submitted that talked about a need to review and potentially adjust the criteria used to justify higher staffing ratios. And so we have talked about the need for additional acuity adjustments in the future. And this potentially is consistent with that thematically about providers asking for additional acuity adjustments. Before I hand it back, I think I have, actually, I believe I have one more slide. Let me just check real quick. I have a summary slide. So let's go to slide 31. This is the summary slide. Before I hand it back to Robert, any questions or comments? Can we scroll back to any of the feedback slides to get some comments from the members of the advisory group?
Steve, it's Chris. Slide 29, question 1. Just curious, you got 19 providers responded, 4 categories. How many of them gave you feedback, or would you lump into each of those categories? I'm curious to see how many of the 19 are, still have, or it's still a major issue for them with tracking costs by billing size and group.
I don't have each split, but I can absolutely pull that and provide it.
Okay, fantastic.
Any other questions or comments before I hand it back?
Steve, this is Greg. I have a question. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. You had just mentioned towards the end of your comments about some acuity concerns with one-on-ones and two-on-ones. Can you put a little meat on those bones? It kind of made me wonder, was that feedback coming from the providers suggesting there needed to be more data around being able to to properly staff? Was it around, a person's plan says they need to have 2 people and we can only have 1? Like what was that? That just kind of caught my attention a little bit. What was that all about?
So Greg, the feedback actually looked at, would DDA consider expanding the criteria that would get enhanced staffing?
Okay. Okay. All right. That's a little different than what I was thinking then. Okay. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for Steve? Okay, great. Next slide, please. So this is a summary of the decisions that we've made. And as you can see for items 1, 2, and 7, we'll continue to have some discussions internally and give this team an update when we meet again in August. Next slide. Okay, we do have 20 minutes, but before I turn over, I do want to thank all of you for your thoughtful comments. That we had some great productive dialogue today. But before we move on to next steps and adjournment, are there any walk-on items for discussion?
Robert, this is Greg. I have another question. Can you go back 1 slide?
To the decision summary?
Yeah, right there. So whenever we're involved in planning in our organization, one of the things that we try not to do in terms of action steps is to use the word consider too much, because it feels like it's a potential, it's not necessarily an actionable word. And I'm not taking that to task in the DDA summary decisions, but I guess my question is a little bit more around, I see in number 6 there, you use the word update, which to me is we're actually doing something. versus most of the others where it's like we're talking about it, we're thinking about it, and we're considering it. And of course, I understand we're not ready to take actionable steps in all of these areas. Do you, based on this chart of these 8 items, and also based on the conversation that we had a little bit earlier in the day, where it seemingly felt like there was a pretty big deal that was just kind of hanging out there, which is this unbillable time, and we haven't really figured out how to capture it yet. And while it's a big deal, it's not really a priority for next year. Just wondering how I'm not holding your feet to the fire on this, but how realistic is it that we get actionable in all 8 of these areas on this chart? Do you feel like we really have the opportunity to continue using good data and make, a decision, whether that decision is a yes or a no? Or do you think we're going to get to the end of the cycle and have 3 or 4 of these things out there where we're going to go, yeah, we're still kind of thinking about that? I'm just curious.
So this is Laura. I'm going to jump in. I think we've been making the best decisions possible with the data that we have, and we'll change the semantics, to your point, to be clear. But we are trying to make the best decisions with the data we have.
Yeah, and I guess to that point, do we believe that we will have all of the data necessary? I guess that's my question. I'm not questioning in any way, and I hope it didn't come across that way, that I'm suggesting that we're just parking stuff and saying like, yeah, we'll think about that. I think data has driven a lot of this process and needs to continue to drive even more of it as we go forward. I guess my question is, I don't want to get to the end of this cycle and go, yeah, we really can't address that because we didn't get all the data we needed, versus, you know what, if we're not able to get this data by this date and time, we're not going to be able to move in these areas. And I guess it's more of an anecdotal question of, do we feel like, as we're, provider feedback, considering these things, do we feel like we have done all that we can to actually get everything that we need in order to make a kind of a go forward decision? I guess that's really my question. And is there something that we can do as part of this team here to move that forward quicker if it needs to be moved forward quicker?
I'll respond to that. I think the earlier conversation, Greg, that Karen Lee started with the providers changing the way that they're doing business and, thinking differently about data is what we're going to have to collectively deal with. I mean, we've got a lot of people who are still transitioning from PCIS2 into LTSS. You and your organization, Karen, and the other 3 early adopters have, I think, a much better feel for the data. So, I think as DDA, we would ask you for, help us develop some of the data points that would be informative.
Okay, thank you, Bernie.
While we're back on this slide, I had 2 questions about 2 items. And I know we've prioritized certain things, we prioritized certain issues this year. And I know there's been discussion about acuity and employment. I know there was discussion about employment and working with the Employment First group, but I'm just wondering, I couldn't really flip back through all of the materials to the, end of last year, beginning of this year around the priorities, but will there be an ability to have something on the list for the next rate cycle? Sort of how, I guess the question is, what will the process be to set priorities for the next rate cycle?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. So the process will be very similar to what we did at the beginning of this rate process, where we kind of collaborated to develop that list of priority, and then prioritize that list, and distill it down to the 2 or 3 things that we would have, time to tackle, depending, obviously on the how heavy of a lift those items are. So not saying that 2 to 3 is the number, but we'll have that opportunity to collaborate and make those decisions and prioritize what we want to work for, what we want to work on for the FY26 cycle.
Okay, thanks. So we're not locked into these 8 for 26.
No.
Okay, thank you.
You are welcome. So next slide, please.
I'm going to jump. I'm on to the next slide also because it's the general comment following up on what Greg said, and Karen, as far as training for providers on how to track downtime, excuse me, not downtime, non-billable time. If we could get some, if the DDA particularly could find some good training over the course of the next 9 months for providers to start to really figure out how to track downtime, and that would probably be it would be helpful if that would be a priority to get some training for us.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Scott. We'll definitely note that. Any other questions before we move on? Okay, if we can jump to slide 34, please. So we look forward to our next meeting. The next meeting is Thursday, August 10th from 12:30 to 2:30. And at the August meeting, we'll be given updates on the recommendations related to program support, facilities, and the training components of the BRIC, as well as share an update slide showing the impact of the updating of the 2018 BLS to 2021 for those meaningful day services. We will also work on coordinating a meeting with the Optimus team and Max to discuss the difference in methodologies used in the data analysis. So that will happen in between the July and August meeting. So members of the public who would like to observe the meeting can register through the DDA training calendar shown here on this slide, which is linked to the form. All you have to do is register once and you'll receive reminders each meeting via GoToMeeting. Before we adjourn, I want to turn it back over to our Secretary and Deputy Secretary for any closing remarks.
Bernie, you want to go first or you want me to go?
You can go, I'll follow you. Thank
So
you.
I just want to thank you all again. I took pages of notes, and we hear you loud and clear, and Greg will try and do a better job in looking at that chart and using more definitive statements. And just want to reiterate what I said. We are doing the best we can with the data we have to really get to a steady state that will meet the needs of the providers and especially the providers that serve our patients of Maryland. So I really appreciated the dialogue today. So thank you.
Yeah, I did too. And I was reflecting as Secretary Scott was speaking that we've come a real long way since the first meeting, way back when, when we did the first cycle, et cetera. I think that, initially, not having done this process, we were kind of like feeling our way in the dark a little bit. And now I think we are matured as this process keeps moving along. And, again, Laura, how your comment, yeah, no, we're not locked into those 8. as Robert responded to you. I mean, this has got to be an interactive process that we have with you as we move forward. And again, I think we need to have some initial dialogue and more dialogue as, again, I think as we know that our early adopters like Greg's agency, Karen's agency, are able to take a look at different data collection points. So I look forward to that discussion.
Great, thank you. And just a reminder to send us your feedback. I put the email address in the chat. So, you know, prior to the next meeting. And with that, enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.